better. Welcome. This is my third class back-to-back, so I haven't a fucking clue what I'm talking about. But welcome to the last of our talks, our 5 talks. It's quite sad. It's quite a sad and poignant moment. I think it deserves an awe. 1, 2, 3. Oh, there we go. That's good. Right. Yeah, we've got quite a lot to get through. There's whiskies in front of you, cask strength whiskies, so be aware of that. You might want to dilute them, you might not, but be responsible. The measures are deliberately not huge as a result of that, because we are responsible. Yeah, aren't we? Georgie, aren't we? Yeah. There's going to be 3 fantastic cocktails that Ryan has devised, and there's various pots kicking about with strange liquids and powders and beans and various things in that. We didn't bring everything. I don't think everybody's necessarily got them. So if you just make sure that everybody, when we begin talking about what's in these pots, pass them around amongst yourselves. I would recommend quite early on, the ones with lids on, keep the lids on until we tell you to take them off, all right? This room is going to stink by the end of it. Okay, promise.
And as actually probably a piece of housekeeping, it's the clue is in the title a bit. So extreme flavors, some of those really honk. And they're not exactly ideal tasting glasses, but don't do what I did and stick your nose into it, because it's going to be quite funny watching your faces as we go through this anyway. But they are fitting of the title. So some of them, have a bit of a funk to them. But also, as they let us put on the bottom of our tasting mat, there's a couple of thank yous. There's also the reminder to do the interactions with us, rate us on the app, all of the wonderful things that help us keep doing this. But actually, this is, as Dave alluded to, this is a wrap-up. I actually can see a few people that I think have made it to all 5 of our series. And it's kind of been a blast doing this, and I'm kind of surprised that we've been allowed to get away with what we have over the years. And a particular thanks, it's lovely to be doing this with Georgie, a really old friend, who, please give a round of applause. She has battled to bring legally into this country a load of cask samples of amazing whiskies that we do get to try. But none of this is a very easy thing to coordinate. So a massive thanks to her. And every year I try and not make the CAP's life difficult. And I am the example pain in the ass at every one of their briefings as the year comes around. So a massive thanks to them for helping putting this all together. So please. And we have hashtags. We are doing our usual heresy, and it's an absolute honor to be doing this with the best speaker in our industry.
Rubbish.
And so we've got some very fun things to go through.
He's doing the sound. You know? He's a rapper, this guy. Various handles there. Those of you who haven't joined up with scotchwhisky.com, please do. It's free, okay? Daily. It's a news site. It's got massive amount of information. Every single Scotch whisky distillery there in detail, plus every Scotch whisky brand. Just an amazing resource. Seriously, done by other people, not me, done by other people, but regular tasting notes every Friday, all new releases being tasted. It's free. Join up, join the family, please. Get involved. All right, let's rock and roll. Scotch, the final frontier. These have been the voyages of the starship Heretic. Its 5-year mission to explore forgotten worlds, to seek out new insights and possibilities. To go boldly, grammar. where no one, inclusive, has gone before. Okay. Talk amongst yourselves. Sing along, actually. There you go.
Yeah.
Right, and this is what we're going to be talking about. Ryan.
So we have Pikachu on acid. which is quickly becoming a bit of a feature image in most of the talks we do now, along with the cat riding the unicorn, which I'm sure you all know very well by now. And this was something that I think it's been brewing in the background of all of the talks that we've been going through. So the different themes that we looked at, the madness of rancio last year, and the smoke and the others beforehand. And I think this is something that's really fitting, and it kind of sums up what we're trying to look at with this whole mission. And it's really looking into this, I suppose, this different conversation that we're fed around the way we taste. So on one hand, we're always told that we're very complex organisms, and we can we're adapted to be able to pick up tiny nuances, and it's true, because on the other side, we're also told that we're quite simplistic. And the fact is, we're both of those things. And we're drawn towards stuff in a very kind of primal manner. And we going back to that idea of kind of gratuitous flavor is something that we've been kind of trying to explore in a lot of this. And there's this idea that we're not able to pick up the crazy nuances that surround us. And that we're guided towards things like sugar and fats and salts. Of course, that is true. But the reality is, there is a complex world of flavor out there, and the kind of arms race between creatures and nature is very much what we're part of as well. And so although we will seek out those things, our color associations, the fact that we find red things up to 10% more sweet is a kind of tie back to some of those kind of natural tendencies that we have. But the fact is, ripe fruit and those kind of indicators that we explored in kind of a more primal sense of nature are not that prevalent. We weren't, kind of ripe fruit was a treat for us. And the fact is that we actually do seek out complexity. We are creatures that find things that are simple boring. They, gratuitously sweet things, we grow out of them. We gravitate towards things that are more complex. And I don't mean that in the sense where you kind of go from bland flavors things and you mature onto Scotch whiskey, because that's not what we're trying to say. But there is a much wider, complex world of flavor out there, and that is actually what really resonates with us. And what we're going to look at through these flavors is that this exists in the world, and it really exists in Scotch as well.
Complexity is undoubtedly going to be one of the key. Complexity, balance, and extreme. So our mission, because we are all now on the Starship Heretic, okay, guys? Think about this for a second. And I'm proud of saying this. And it seems like a bold statement, but I'm proud of being able to say this as a Scotsman, really. But Scotch is the world's most complex and wide-ranging oak-aged spirit. And that's not denigrating cognac, which I adore, or bourbon, or rum, or whatever. Scotch just has a greater range of flavours than any other oak-aged spirit. It goes everything from very, very light and delicate and fragile on one end, right up to something that's big and heavy and powerful at the other end, and every point in between. So it's not from a narrow band of flavour and complexity within that. It's got this huge, huge range of flavours which are there within Scotch whisky. And this is what baffles me, because I'm not a bartender. Any of you who have ever witnessed me stand behind the bar will attest to the fact I'm not a bartender. But surely, logically, our science officer here says it should offer up more possibilities in terms of mixed drinks, because it's got this incredible complexity to it. But it seems to be shut down. It seems to be still stuck in this thou shalt not mix, or if you do mix, it's going to be made into a simple drink, which is something that we're going to come on to later. So Scotch is still overlooked in many ways. It's growing in popularity, but it's not really growing in popularity, or its complexities aren't perhaps being understood by the bartending community as yet in the way that I think could happen as we begin to move forward. So part of what we're going to be doing over the next hour and a half or so is kind of opening people's minds to the possibilities of mixing Scotch and confronting and overturning all these prejudices which are built up around it. And that's basically what all the talks have been about over the past 5 years. It's kind of saying, well, forget all you know about Scotch, forget about all these rules that have built up, forget about this idea that it can't be drunk long or it can't be mixed or whatever, or that smoke is only one thing. Smoke's got incredible complexity. Let's confront all of this constantly let's not be lazy about it, because if we're going to take Scotch whisky forward, we have to challenge and confront all of this, and we have to challenge and confront ourselves intellectually about how we make drinks, or intellectually how we then talk about it, which is kind of my job, without contravening the prime directive, which is being responsible or something. I don't know, I put that in Star Trek. All right, so this is what we did. We kicked off. What did we kick off with? Can you remember that?
It was White Lion's Whiskey Tales, I think. I think that was the first one.
Yeah, it was kind of the history. It was this kind of history of Scotch. And so kind of pointing out that any time in Scotch whisky's history, when it's been popular, it's been drunk long, or it's been flavoured, or it's been mixed. This idea that you only drink it neat is actually only something that's come into any particular, or gained any particular weight or resonance in the past 30 years. So it was kind of redressing that balance. And then we looked at new cocktails.
Yeah. Exploring, I suppose it was looking at how we were pigeonholing how Scotch tended to be mixed. It was being used in a manner where it was either just adding smoke, or it was just being used as a lovely vanilla-led spirit to kind of give backbone and a malty richness towards a drink. And it was looking at how we can really delve into the nuances of a whiskey. How can we apply it in a much more kind of considered manner that is relevant to the actual whiskey, and adapt it into cocktails that do this in a respective manner.
Then we looked at smoke, did a kind of deep dive into smoke, which was good fun. Smoke from all around the world. What to do, how to use smoke and how not to use smoke, which is actually, I think, probably the most interesting bit about the whole thing. And then last year, how many of you were here last year for rancio talk? Not many. There we are. I think one best seminar. There you go. That's how good it was. And we will actually touch on, I'm glad not all of you came last year, because we will be touching, we won't be repeating, that would be lazy, but we will be kind of touching on a lot of these different aspects as we spend our time kind of wrapping everything up. So the talk about rancio was really looking at rare flavors within whiskey, this kind of really weird, elusive flavor that you only pick up on whiskies, aged in refill casks, which have been sitting these refill casks for 25 years or above. And it doesn't always appear. It sometimes appears, sometimes it doesn't. It's this fascinating, elusive scent. And we did, a fair amount with Ariel. I don't know if she's here, but Ariel, who was at Noma at that point, and exploring all of that. Anyway, thank you for buying the tickets. I should have said that to begin with. Thank you for buying the tickets, guys, because I know they're not cheap. One of the reasons you bought the ticket was you probably read the little preamble that you see in the program or on the website. I have to apologise because that's not what we're going to do. Well, we are kind of doing it, but Ryan and I sat down. You've got to put these bloody things in November, and it seemed a good idea. And we talked with Georgie about it and said, well, let's do extreme flavour. Let's talk about extreme flavour, and we put together a presentation, and it got accepted. And then we sat down and Dandelion and looked at it and both went, nah. There was nothing wrong with it. It was wonderfully intellectually challenging. It would have been phenomenal. It was just a bit simplistic. It was a bit kind of Whiskey 101. It was repeating stuff that perhaps you would all know. And that's just a word. We will assume that you know something about whiskey in this as we begin to delve into fairly esoteric areas. So reversed the process of the whole thing. So rather than spirits kind of seem to exist in this bubble, in this compartmentalized way of looking at it, silo thinking when it comes to this is cognac, this is rum, this is Scotch, this is Canadian, this is bourbon, etc., etc. And they kind of function within that particular area, and you're not allowed to diverge from that at all. And they have their own rules, and they dictate all the flavors which are permissible to mix with. But we live in an indifferent universe, my dear friends. We live in a universe of flavor. These flavors which we're going to be discussing today exist around us. They're in foodstuffs, they're in nature. These flavors don't care if whiskey engages with them or not. So we turned it on its head. So what we're doing is actually sailing through this universe, looking at the universe of flavour and seeing how Scotch can relate to that flavour, rather than working at it from a Scotch-centric point of view, which is a bit kind of egotistical and arrogant. We're sort of saying, look at the world around you and start using this incredible array of different flavours which are out there, finding ways of replicating them in Scotch. You know, are they there in Scotch whisky? Can they be pulled out? Can they be accentuated or whatever? Right.
And this wasn't just tasting notes. You know, we were delving into some of these things. We were trying to understand where these processes came from, and some of this was taking the learnings of our previous bouts of heresy. And what we found is it's not just analogous flavors that you pick up. A lot of these things exist. They are shared between whiskey and other things in the world. When we're talking about some of these esters, when we're talking about some of these compounds, they are in these various stinky things that are going to be surrounding us. They are in foodstuffs that we commonly enjoy. And the amazing thing is, in this massive range of flavor that surrounds us in the world, in all of these different extremes, they then are mirrored in whiskey. So if we can then look to some of these examples in the world and see how they're used in different cultures, see how they're applied, how they're created, what they're existing alongside, then we can start to think in the same way about how that can apply to what we do in the whiskey. So you might not want to just focus on that particular point, but you can see how it then forms a larger mass and how you can then start to include it in places that whiskey might not have been cropping up in the past. And for us to be able to take whiskey into the future, this is crucial. We need to stop thinking of it as that simply kind of vanilla-led malt spirit. You know, that kind of prestigious thing that stays on the back bar and only gets drunk at certain occasions. We need to start to look at how all of these flavors are examples of things in the rest of the world, and therefore use it as a way of kind of bringing Scotch into new circles. And that's the only way it's going to continue to forge new paths in the future.
So we've deliberately looked at extreme points in flavour. So we've been pushing these things out. So let's kind of explain what we're going to do. So we are now flying through the flavour solar system. Okay. So we've gone at warp factor 6, or perhaps warp factor 7, towards this new flavour solar system, which we're going to be exploring. We're going to find each planet, so we're going to beam down to each of these individual planets, and each individual planet has a particular flavour and a particular environment where this flavour is prevalent, and we're going to examine what that flavour is, how it manifests itself, and then analyse it once back on board the vessel and find ways in which whiskey can then relate to all of that by adapting it in various techniques and various serves. Extended techniques if necessary. We're pushing this out. You know, it's time to stop kind of going, well, highballs are great, and I love highballs. I drink a huge amount of highballs. They're great, but if we're going to be serious about Scotch whisky, it can have neat, it can have with water, it can be a highball, it can be a Rob Roy, but it can be so many other things. And only by engaging in kind of an extreme way with those real outliers do we really get an idea of what the complexity of the whisky is.
So we've got those as cask samples, so we've got examples of whiskies that display these characteristics, things that have these extremes in them. We have the reference tastings or things to smell. Actually, I really don't advise you taste any of them. That's really not going to go very well. Things to smell, and then we're also going to try these in drinks and those extended techniques. So a lot of these things do exist in nature. Nature applies a lot of these crazy, laborious ways of making these compounds and flavors. If you were going to design them, you would not design them this way. No religious commentary on this, but it's something that we can apply those things. We can adapt them, we can manipulate them, we can look to the way nature creates some of these flavors and use it to hopefully apply into some hopefully interesting drinks for you to try alongside the whiskies as well.
You also note I've spelt flavour correctly. Just okay. Ooh. Landing party went down onto planet Ester, and this was the landing party report. The planet seems benign. There are fruit trees everywhere, a pleasing garden under a pink sky. That was later in the day. The sun had just begun to go down. Our instruments showed that the air was safe to breathe, but did indicate there was some danger, but we were allowed to take off the breathing apparatus, and then it began to rain. And it was discovered that the rain which was coming down was in fact alcohol. or ethanol. And it led to some crew members, who shall not be named, but they're sitting in the front row here from Dandelion, running around with their mouths open and their tongues hanging out, drinking the rain, with the inevitable consequence. The fruits, which seemed so tempting initially, were all kind of oozing a liquid, and when we analysed the liquid, we discovered the liquid was acid. And when that rainstorm came in, that rainstorm of ethanol falling from the pink sky came in, hitting those acids, suddenly aromas changed. The planet Ester. Now the science.
So we were actually going to have a load of foam banana sweets for you here, but the esters we did have got confiscated by the TSA. And the foam banana sweets are actually much harder to get here. I don't know how you guys have grown up without having banana-flavored deliciousness everywhere. But those are the things that you will pick up. So esters are formed when you have an acid combining with an alcohol. It gives the fruity aroma. They form hydrogen bonds, which is great, so it means they're water soluble, but they're also more volatile than their parent acids, which is what makes them brilliant for us to be able to smell. So these are things that you will have come across. Some of you might have come across some of the chemical names for them. The delicious isoamyl acetate, which was the flavor of my youth because they used it to flavor everything because kids love it. It tastes like bananas, and banana tastes great. So it crops up in lots of things in nature. So your ethyl acetates are your green apple flavors. Hexyl acetate, again, for those of you who saw Ariel's chat on funk, it's where it's taking that parent acid and that alcohol to form these esters. But they're hugely complex, and these are things that, a banana is not simply isoamyl acetate. It tastes like it smells, like very funky ripe banana. But bananas, obviously fruits combine these in much more complex ways. It's not just simply about having these as isolated esters, and that's where you create the aromatics of fruits. Nature is definitely not that simplistic. And there's usually a little bit of a yin and yang in some of these things. We're going to touch upon this as we delve into some of the more funkier flavors, I think is probably the best way of describing it, actually. But you have things like, a pineapple is of course fruity. It's really tropical, it's heady, especially when you get it from an environment where it grows best. But it's got a cheesy element, it's got a creaminess, almost a meatiness to it as well. And some of these esters in kind of small concentrations are very pleasant, they're delicate, they're aromatic, but they can easily, in higher concentrations, start to become quite painful. These are things that exist around us hugely in the world of our world of flavor. It's things that we encounter probably most regularly in a whole range of ways.
I don't know, how many of you have tried high ester Jamaican rum? A few, not many. Do try, especially stuff from Hamden. Really interesting. And their top ester rum is called continental style, DOK. And it's driven up to insane levels of esteriness, and you nose it, and it smells like paint. It smells like paint and glue and acetone. It is actually painful to smell. But you put a tiny little drop in that and then dilute it with either neutral spirit or water, and it becomes beautifully pineapple-y. So they're very, very potent and very important chemicals. Which are around us, everything that's there. I mean, apple, and as Ryan was saying, apples have got like 38 different esters within them. Pears have got about 15 different esters in there. There is complexity within that world. So there's a complex world that we should be engaging with, and probably do engage with, but in that kind of slightly lazy way that we all do when we get a little bit older. We kind of stop to forget to stop to smell the flowers. We ought to be engaging with the world of flavour and the world of aroma once more. This is a really handy little chart. It's a great little website, jameskennedymonash.wordpress.com. Just Google ester chart. He's done even bigger ones of this. It's fairly straightforward, fairly simple, but it's a handy one for bartenders, I think, to have, because it kind of gives you an idea of how flavours then combine together. And we will now taste the whiskey. Hey! God, that was weary. Right.
So these are a little pokey. They are not diluted strength.
Yeah, 61%. Okay, so the first whiskey you've got is Brackla. So it's from the Royal Brackla Distillery, which is just outside the town of Nairn, up on the Moray Firth next to Codder Castle. Those of you who studied Macbeth at school, who's heard of Shakespeare? That's Macbeth was Thane of Codder, and the witches are meant to be running around naked around Royal Brackla Distillery or something like that. Esters are created in whiskey and deliberately created in whiskey in a number of different ways. And I'll just rattle through it because it's not really whiskey 101, it's more to do with flavour. But how do we, as distillers, if I was a distiller, create esters? First thing is during the mashing regime, when you've got your grist, and there's probably might be some grist kicking about there, that kind of powdery stuff that's sitting there on the table. Hot water is added to that. Enzymes in the barley transform into sugars, and the sweet liquid is drained from the bottom of the mash tun. Boom. If you do that quite quickly, you'll pull through some particulate matter, some bits of husk, etc., which will be carried through into the fermenter. And as a result of that, you will make a spirit which is more nutty and cereal in character. Okay? That's called cloudy wort. Sounds like a dreadful disease, but it's called cloudy wort. Some distilleries want to do that because that's part of their distillery character. It's not right or wrong. But if you don't want that, you will pump either settle or pump very, very gently so you don't get any of that cloudiness coming through in your wort. Second thing is long fermentation. We're going to be talking about fermentation in more detail in a second. But long fermentation. Why? Why does that create esters? Because it starts off being sweet. You know, that liquid that you've got off the bottom of your mash tun is sweet. It's a sweet, sugary liquid. But as that fermentation continues, it becomes more acidic. And so what's happening? You've got ethanol and you've got acids. What are you going to get as a result of that? Esters. So the longer fermentation is, the more you're going to be driving up that esterification process. So even though the yeast has died down, died off, in fact, after about 50 hours, 48, 50 hours, if you keep that wash now in the wash back, you will continue that esterification process. So long fermentation is necessary. And then the third element within making new make, for it does happen in cask as well, is the way that you distill it. So this is Brackla Stillhouse. As you can see, the stills are actually quite small. They're at the same height as Georgie there. I asked Georgie to send some photos of Brackla. All she sent me was photos of herself in various distilleries. So that's Brackla. Beautiful, beautiful distillery. Very kind of plain stills, quite narrow neck. And the line arm, which is the bit at the very top going into the condensing system, points up. That means that all the heavy elements, the heavy compounds in the alcohol vapor, will struggle to get over that arm, and they will reflux or turn back into liquid and fall back down to be redistilled. So only the lightest and most volatile aromas are going to be coming across in that system. They include esters, okay? So there's a whole different number of ways in which a distiller can actually produce this particular flavor, and the flavor which is around us in the world. So, have we tasted it? Been babbling on, right, Ryan? What do you think about that?
So actually, I think this is a really beautiful example of this. I think some of the Bracklas I've tasted have a nice fern quality, but this is just wonderfully driven towards that fruitiness as well.
It's kind of laser focused, I think,
Yeah.
Brackla. It's got this great, great acidity, even when you put it in sherry casks. That acidity you get, when you taste it. I mean, it is 61%, but you've got this real clean acidity coming through. And you get that fruit, you get that intensity, that brightness. Ask you a question. How then would you use that? How would you engage with this particular whiskey?
So I think the fruits, in a lot of ways, are the bread and butter of our cocktails. So particularly citrus, it forms the background of so much that we do. But if you think about trying to use something like watermelon, really wonderfully aromatic, and it's got lovely associations of summer to it, and you want to be able to pick up some of those kind of lovely red berry notes that are in this, you'll know that if you try and use watermelon, you just end up with sugar and water. You're not getting any of that wonderful concentration that you want to have. And I think what's amazing about this is it's concentrated all of those esters. And trying to then kind of marry with those things is where we use a lot of trying to, again, concentrate those flavors. And we're trying to do it in a manner that doesn't then destroy them, doesn't take them into jam flavors. So this is where we rely on things like cold processing techniques. So using things at low temperature, using things as an extractant to be able to carry some of those flavors across. But it's also where we do some careful controlled fermentations. So things like vinegars and with some kind of low ABV fermentations, we're trying to then create some of those esters, be able to marry with them so you've got some of those flavors in there. But I think, as Dave alluded to, this is so pinpoint. It's very, very sharp, and I think that's what needs to be married into this drink. So trying to find ways that help keep that clarity, other ways to be able to bring those fruitier flavors into these to marry with these style of whiskies.
And for me, that's just an example of the thinking that needs to start taking place. And it's beginning to start taking place in Scotch whisky, but there needs to be a lot more about it. I think we've broken through that barrier which existed, that said, well, Scotch is, it's just a brand, or it's a region, and regions, do not stand up to any intellectual scrutiny whatsoever. Individual terroir might, but regions don't. And that has kind of been pushed to one side to a certain extent, and now people are quite happy to talk about flavour. And you look at the way that somewhere like Black Rock, for example, organises its whiskies by flavour. Various other bars around the world taking a leaf from wine menus and sort of saying, well, actually people buy flavour. They don't actually necessarily buy by distillery. Glenfiddich, I'm looking at the great David C. Stewart, MBE there. Glenfiddich. If you look at Glenfiddich 12, 15, 18, 25, identifiably Glenfiddich, but different aspects of it. And if you plot it on the flavour map, you've got one which is lighter in character, the 12-year-old, something which is much richer, say the 18-year-old. And so people will gravitate towards a particular flavour. So we have to kind of look at it, rather than kind of paying lip service to this thing, well, flavour is king. We actually have to then challenge ourselves to say, well, what is flavour and what are these flavours which are coming out? Why are they there, and how then do we use it?
And if we've got all these amazing flavours and we're championing that, it's the nice thing that Scotch is retaining its crown at the moment, but there are people who are challenging towards that. And if we're not starting to engage with it, I would love to see on menus people using a whiskey as spectacular as this in a considered manner in a cocktail. And that's not there for the bling factor of it, or being able to say, I've used this rare cask whiskey in a cocktail, but finding ways to say, this whiskey is wonderful, it demonstrates characteristics that I think are fantastic. I'm going to try and find a way to showcase that displays everything a good cocktail will do. Highlight a certain aspect, bring more people into the fold, and just allow you to understand in depth a different side of the product.
So we left orbit, and we went on impulse power, because the next planet was quite close. Does anybody watch Star Trek, or is it just me? It was great. My daughter is a huge Star Trek fan. It's another thing I've influenced. She loves Sun Ra as well. I'm so proud. We great fun putting this together. So that this is her sound effect. Oh, planet decay. This is where it gets funky, guys. We eased you in with the esters. Now we're going to get down and dirty. Landing party report from this. There was something stinky about the planet, which smelt of rot and putrefaction. The air was thick with the smell of sweat. We looked around for piles of rotting fish and green meat, and the stink of wild goats and the smell of sweating humanoids. It is disgusting, but somehow compelling. Everything seems to seethe and bubble. It is Ulysses, I don't know who wrote this, it's Ulysses being pulled to the rocks by the sirens. The sirens, oh no, I'm not going to hit Greek mythology. It is a world of ferment. Here's a quote from the great Sandor Katz. Who's read Sandor's book on fermentation? Please get it.
Yeah, you really should.
It's called, in the way that all great food and drink books are called by incredibly prosaic names, it's called Fermentation. Really, seriously, well worth doing. You'll have jars and stuff bubbling in your bars and your homes, etc. But, in fact, I have until one exploded, and you know, we're still picking the glass out of the windows, or the window frames rather. Anyway, so what Sander says here is between fresh and rotten, there is creative space in which some of the most compelling flavors arise. And because of the existence of such a creative space is so ubiquitous across cultures, there is no sharp objective distinction between the foods that are fermented and foods that are rotten. Creative space, guys. That's the world that we occupy. That's the extreme world. That's what we're talking about. It's there, teetering on the brink, on that kind of razor's edge between something which is acceptable and something which is a little bit off-putting. But by God, it's a really interesting place to be. That's where the best writing comes from. It's where the best music comes from. That creative space is where the best bartending comes from as well. And it's something that we have to engage with, no matter what you're looking at, but I would say particularly with whiskey, because of the extremity of some of the flavors, there is this fantastic creative space which is sitting there with flavors that you think are just a bit weird and just a little bit funky. How do I use them? Can I use them? Are they actually off-putting? Well, no, because they are the very things that ought to be stimulating you to be making greater and greater drinks. There we are. Boom. Ryan, what's fermentation?
So we're not going to dwell too much on the details of it, but obviously fermentation is the activity of using kind of helpful bacteria, friendly microbes and or fungi, with the metabolic conversion of energy stores, usually a sugar, into acids, gases, and alcohol. So we've exploited this for the last 10,000 years. We have a very close relationship with these microorganisms, and it's this crazy thing of the modern world where we perform genocide regularly on swathes of microorganisms that have essentially helped us evolve. And it's a mad thing. I think this is probably, as Dave alluded to, it's this area that is the most compelling, it's the most interesting, it's this funny middle ground. And I think it's always, you know, often as a team we'll get together and we're like, is this too weird? And it's probably the area where we're most excited by being, not for gimmick, but for the fact that it's pushing ourselves. There is a wonderful quote that we had when we heard Albert Adria speak, and you know, he said, there's no reason to do it if you're not shit scared. You know, you really should be trying to push yourself, otherwise you're not doing it right. And actually, wonderfully said, he's like, if you want to be scared, open a restaurant. If you really want to be shit scared, open a cocktail bar, which I think is something that a lot of us can associate with. But I think there's also this aspect of it's controlled decay. This idea of kind of time to me is becoming this really fascinating kind of intangible thing to try and kind of communicate through food and drink. It's something that really fascinates me of how do we try and hold on to time? How do we try and communicate what it is? And that to me is what fermentation is such a wonderful example for. It helps us to try and create some of this conversion, but halt it in a manner that you can pick up different points of it, you can analyze it, you can delve into it, and you can try and understand what's happening in that crazy process. There's no clear delineation between what is good and bad. Between this space where you're constantly pulled between kind of positive and negative, I think is this wonderful aspect of it. And there's going to be a recurring theme with some of this stuff where it's good but also slightly weird. And that's going to crop up as we certainly taste a lot of the things in front of you. I know you have a drink coming around.
There's a drink coming around which we'll if everybody gets them, we'll jump forward to the drink before it gets too dilute, but that's fine. So move on. So, you know, here's some examples of rotten food. You know, washed rind cheese up there on the left-hand side. Miso. The one at the bottom left-hand corner, something called muri, which we'll talk about in a second. There's funazushi from Lake Biwa in Japan, down there in the bottom right. And in the middle, fish sauce, which we might come to in a little sec. We are surrounded by fermented food. It's part of the natural process of life, you know, and it's something that we really should start being engaged with. I mean, whiskey is fermented initially as well. So you get cheese, you get soy, you get miso, you get kimchi, you get chocolate, you get tobacco, you get tea, you get, you know, beer, you get wine, you get whiskey. We live in this world because, and we have to, and this understanding of fermentation is very, very ancient, as Ryan was saying there. Because if you don't process the food, it will go off. It will go bad. So, you know, time rather than, it's kind of, again, what Ryan's talking about, you know, time rather than being the enemy, i.e. it's rotting the food, if you process it in a particular way, it becomes the friend. And one way of actually doing this is fermentation. And once you do begin to ferment this, especially in the area of food, you begin to push this out to extremes. And I think we are actually hardwired to appreciate all of this. There is something about this dangerous middle ground which we like to play in. So is that a question now?
Yeah. So what is the evolutionary significance of some of this, you know, things like umami perhaps, and how much of it is actually a learned behavior, you know, like, you know, a child would not like this, but we've learned, like bitter should be replaced.
There's I suppose particularly in the modern day, there's a lot of this belief that raw foods are better for us. And actually in the same way that cooking allowed us to convert nutrients into a better bioavailability, the same thing happened with fermentation. So we're going to talk about a bit of abiotic and biotic decomposition, but the availability of certain nutrients was spiked by primary fermentations, by the microorganisms that we were exploiting in this manner. So controlled fermentation allowed certain, particularly amino acids, to become more available, things that we couldn't produce, we needed to get from our diet, and they were becoming highly concentrated in these foods. So the way that we attached ourselves to them, the reason why we love this umami, these glutamates, is because we need them as part of the diet. And we learned that pretty early on, that by converting our foods through some of these techniques, it made some of these components more available to us.
And also, I mean, it's a fantastic question. There's also a cultural aspect to this as well, which, if you don't mind, we'll kind of come to. We'll hang that from the chandelier, and we'll touch on that. But fantastic question.
I mean, there's still the age-old thing that for so long beer was safer than water, and you know the fact that I'm not going to quite put it down to its conclusion that that's why teetotalers die younger, but you know it was the fact that we are adapted to use these techniques. It's part of our biology, and you know the period it's happened over is linked enough that it has changed the way we develop as civilizations.
And a quote here, I didn't want to put up too many slides, but from Professor Paul Rosen, who works at the University of Pennsylvania, psychologist, and he does a lot of work on flavour and the understanding of flavour. And he said the classic odour of disgust is the odour of decay, which is of course the odour of death, and we'll come to that in a wee while. But it's also the odour of fermentation. So there you have that creative space kind of teetering on. But you know, there's this kind of fine line, really, isn't there?
Yeah, it's very much. There's a fine line between fermentation and decomposition, and that abiotic and biotic decomposition. There's cadaverine and putrescine, which I'm sure you can guess where they came from, and they're foul-smelling and they are toxic. We are repulsed by them for a good reason. So there's certain things that, again, our biology will guide us with a lot of that stuff. The fact that you will physically repel yourself from a corpse is because you don't want to eat it. But there are many fermenting foods that display, you know, in isolation, they'll display a bit of a disgusting aspect. But the whole, if you know, in the conjunction of everything that goes on, it also showcases it in a wonderful way. And actually, the stinkier the food, and the more advanced the decomposition is, you know, the conversion of those proteins, the availability of those nutrients, the kind of more opulent its flavor becomes. It's this weird kind of connect thing with them.
And just kind of a few things. That muri down there in the bottom left-hand corner, so that's an ancient Byzantine preserves. It's fermented barley wrapped up in vine leaves, which you can make at home if you want to, if you're into Byzantine cookery. Funazushi over there. So I mean, and Japan is just a culture of fermentation. You know, you think, you know, they are experts in fermentation. So you have stuff like ishiri from Toyama Prefecture, which is squid guts that have been fermented for 4 or 5 years. That funazushi, which is the original sushi, is carp, which has been cured with salt and then fermented with rice on top of it for about 3 years. And when you eat it, it smells of cheese. It's kind of fish cheese. You know, that's brilliant. That's a genius idea. Fish cheese. Love it, you know?
We were going to try and get you some fermented gannet.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're allowed to harvest gannets, baby gannets, in the very, very far north of Scotland. There's only one community still allowed to do it. And I do have a contact there, and we were trying to get some smoked gannet. It's got the taste of anchovy, but the texture of duck. It's really, really interesting. But unfortunately, we couldn't get it. But anchovies,
Yes.
Amazing. And this whole kind of fish thing, it began to really intrigue us. Archaeologists, what's this got to do with whiskey? We'll come to that in a second. Archaeologists in Sweden quite recently uncovered a pit in which had been fermented seal sacks of fish, which had been fermented not with the addition of salt, but with pine bark. Now there's something that could be interesting moving forward. 7,200 BC. So we have been fermenting as a species, coming back to your point, for a very, very long time. And that, for me, is also, I don't think these people just buried a lot of fish and then walked away again. This is evidence of humans beginning to settle down and plant crops and fish, etc., etc. So it's part of civilization. So fermentation, just like brewing and just like distillation, is part of us being a cultured species, part of our kind of intellectual development. And as a result of that, we are now going to talk about fish sauce. Right, you will have a little cup, or some of you will have a little cup of Red Boat, Vietnamese, Ngoc Mam, 70 degrees nitrogen. Have a little smell of that, Ryan.
I would really actually suggest you dip your pinky in this and taste it. It's this to me is like, I really don't think there's anything that isn't made to taste better with a little bit of this. I've used this in cocktails. I also am a firm believer of anchovies on everything, and this is just the liquid way of being able to put anchovies on everything. So this is salted anchovies. That's all it is. And this is a wonderful thing. You want to look out. This brand in particular is absolutely incredible. But where it says 40N on the label, that's what you want to look for. It's the nitrogen, the concentration of amino acids in it. But I think that is, it's just such a perfect example. We are attracted to this funk. Saccharin is boring for us. Yes, sugar is delicious, and it's gratuitous, and it's easy to make things taste delicious by throwing sugar at it or by throwing butter at it. But it stops being complex to us. Instead of adding sugar to things, it was one of the wonderful things that I learned as a chef is you don't need to throw a load of salt on stuff. You can add a little dash of pastis, or you can squeeze a lemon over it, or you can add something like this fish sauce that gives a much greater complexity. It's the same thing happens as bartenders. You don't have to throw sugar at it. You don't have to throw citrus at it. There's a whole range of things, including fish sauce, that can be added to these things. And we always need a little seediness. We need a little bit of that filth. It's fitting, seeing as we're in New Orleans for that. But we'll return to that fact, but just, I mean, what you should be left with, a tiny little dot on your palate, it will linger, and what you'll start to pick up, and I really think actually as you sip other things, you'll start to notice how amazing, like just how everything blossoms on the palate, having had a little dot of that.
It's a transformative ingredient, but it does rot cork, I believe. So if you put it in a dasher behind your bar, you're liable to have an entire... Look, head in the hands, your entire bar flooded with fish sauce, and not many customers as a result. So, it's dispensing has to be taken into consideration. But look, there's a great example of something. It sounds completely fucking mad to add fish sauce to a whiskey cocktail, but why not? Why not a tiny little drop? Because it will have this transformative aspect to it, and we'll come on to a couple of other things as we move through the various planets, which also can have this kind of transformative aspect to it as well.
We put worms in your cocktails last year, so this isn't that much weirder.
Yeah. But but it's also this kind of aversion, attraction aversion thing, which is going on, like the smell of Bourbon Street. Which is, bleach, seafood, vomit, despair. bodily fluids, you name it. It's all there. It's all there in Bourbon Street, but somehow it is kind of weirdly compelling. But yes, I mean, but there is a cultural aspect to this. So some cultures will hate. Chinese people hate smelly cheese, but they love stinky tofu. Yeah.
And I think this is a really important fact. Is often you do taste studies, and it's done by ethnicity. And I think it's a really mad thing. I grew up in Britain. I have no cultural associations with my heritage in Sri Lanka. I drink a lot of tea, and I drink a lot of things associated with those flavors. And so cultural norms will shape the way that you will direct your flavors. And it's as Dave alluded to, there are certain things that people find repulsive in one area and are hugely attracted to in another. And that's the fun of being in our industry. You get to travel around the world and push your boundaries a bit on stuff, except don't try the piss shark stuff in Iceland.
Please don't.
Really not something you want to do to yourself.
But also from a neurological point of view, something that my late mother would have sworn I would never ever say at a seminar, but from a neurological point of view, it's very interesting to see how the brain operates when it comes to aroma. In particular, because your olfactory system is right in your orbitofrontal cortex. It's where your highest brain functions are. And we all have an inbuilt sort of sliding scale of acceptance as far as smell goes, what we like and what we don't like. And actually, if you do an MRI scan of the brain, when you're nosing something, if it's something that you don't like, it will register on a different part of that specific part of your brain to something which is pleasant. But there's plasticity involved in this, and you can relearn. So in other words, from a cultural point of view, there is something which is repulsive, but over time, which comes back to your point, I think, sir, you begin to understand it. So babies, there's some amazing research done on babies. It's hilarious, really. Sort of giving babies bitter things and taking photos of them, just to see, what their reaction is. So we are born to look for sweet things, and we're born with an aversion to bitter, but we begin to culturally begin to understand that some aspects of bitterness, for example, are actually not dangerous. So, our brains are remarkable things. So don't close them down. There's another message. Don't close them down. Accept the world of flavors that Scotch could be sailing through. Damn it. Something from Ariel. Bear this in mind, guys. Long-term fermentation creates new molecules. This requires and inspires a different kind of thinking than we, as cooks and bartenders, are used to. Creative space, living on the edge. Let's have a look at this drink before it gets too dilute. Ryan.
So I think a few of you, those who have been at our seminars in the past or have been a chance to come to White Lion or various talks that we've done will have heard me present a drink with Aberfeldy of a take of our beeswax old fashioned. This is a wonderfully waxy whiskey by itself. And just that idea of going like for like, being able to extenuate that and have that finish really linger on the palate. It's just a fun thing to do with this whiskey because it's got this lovely golden honeyed flavor to it. But what I wanted to do with this was a little bit different this time round. It's a little sweet, I apologize. But what we've done is... It's not blown a £3,000 whiskey this time round. But what I've done is I've looked to use a different type of waxiness. So this is actually a lactic waxiness. So there's a couple of things that have gone into this. So done a milk syrup, so not as a milk punch. This is actually just boiling it down, using the casein in there to give this lovely creaminess. It's using a little bit of fermented, but it's also using a probiotic. So if you think on some of those, there's those kind of buttery notes in the whiskey. It's this lovely kind of creaminess that's able to be pulled out. But instead of using that kind of oiliness from the wax to hold it on the palate, it's using these kind of dairy aspects of it. And if you think on some of those kind of butters, some of those probiotics that have that kind of creaminess on the end, that lingering richness, I've just used that to be able to, again, it's an old-fashioned, really simple, a little bit of sweetness, a touch of bitters around it, but then this creaminess just to hold those flavors on the palate a little longer.
So they have that kind of lactic fermented character beginning to come through. So there's something which can be do. Using Aberfeldy, because Aberfeldy has got this kind of underlying waxiness to it. Waxiness used to be a lot more prevalent in the Scotch whisky industry in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Less common these days. Clynelish pushes it to pretty extreme version, the instant also. And I think that although Aberfeldy's dialed it back, it still seems to be an inherent part of the distillery character there. And it's driven by decay. It's driven by the funk that you get from faints. And people tend to think, well, faints are the sort of stuff that you don't want in your new make spirit. But why don't you get rid of them? It's not just because we're kind of miserable Scottish people and we don't throw them away. It's because they are the funkiness in the oils of the faints are actually a major contributory factor to the final new make character of the spirit. You have to build up your faints before you actually begin to make your character. And what happens with faints over a period of time is that the oils begin to precipitate out and form a gunk at the bottom of the faints receiver. And that is going to be helping to drive the waxiness moving forward. So that world of decay actually exists within whiskey. That funkiness is in there within whiskey. That element of the faints which has driven some of the flavour is there. So the fermentation and decay isn't just there in the decay of the yeast and the transformation of the yeast into all these different flavours. It's actually there in the distillation process itself as well. Which means, I would say, it's completely valid to add some kind of funkiness in there to whiskies as well, because there should be a natural synergy between all these different elements.
Just quick, when you say wax, I'm sorry, here, are you talking about actually using like beeswax, or it's a waxy characteristic that develops through?
Usually it's beeswax that we use. This is a waxiness that's developed through I think it's mainly the probiotic. They're all dead now. Like, they've totally been killed by the whiskey, but they give this lovely creamy finish and it just fills the mouth. And what I think you get in this is you really blossom a lot of the fruitiness out of the whiskey. Again, that kind of funk pleasure kind of thing. I think as a result of that, you taste more of the fruitiness. Because the actual syrup was kind of a bit honking. Like, it had that kind of creamy, buttery, like lactic fermented-y kind of, a bit of grassiness to it. But I think that's lifted the fruitiness out from the drink. So wax as a sensation rather than an ingredient.
And it also takes us into our old friend rancio, but we're a little bit squeezed for time. That kind of weird, again, compelling old country house, beeswax, highly polished furniture, tropical fruit, but also moving into kind of leathery notes, amber grey, musky characteristic, which you get from whiskies which have been aged for a very long period of time in used wood. And those of you who were at that amazing Better Drinking Through Chemistry session yesterday, cognacs aged for a very, very long time in knackered wood in damp cellars, to promote that rancio character, which again is another area that whiskey is really not exploring to any great extent. So there's another flavour possibility which moves out there. Okay, I think we are ready to leave Planet Decay. By the way, Angus Stewart is just a Scottish way of saying Angus Stura. I thought, will I just leave that one hanging there, or will it be nice? It's kind of, I wonder if they've got that over at St. Ester, the Angus Stewart. Okay, Planet Earth. Okay, landing party. You can be the landing party this time.
So we're on a planet where things smell like a freshly ploughed spring field, but also walking through autumn woods. There's mushrooms, a dank quality to it, the smell of fibres and mould and dustiness. We explored further and deeper into the woods. The trees oozed resin, feet crunched and cracked nuts. There was a roasted, burnt smell everywhere. A rustle in the undergrowth, a blast of a strange, oddly compelling scent as a creature scuttles away. Okay, Planet Earth. This is earthiness and nuttiness at their most extremes. It's kind of science of two elements here. And the first one is one called geosmin, which I actually talked about in the class earlier on, which is the smell of the earth, It's the aroma of the field, it's the forest floor, it's that slightly musty old wine cellar, which is actually quite a nice smell. It's that kind of off note that you don't particularly want in beans and beetroot. It's also the smell which helps camels navigate through the desert to find water.
There you go. See, the stuff that you learn. Fucking amazing, isn't it? And the other compound is maltol, which is produced as a Maillard reaction in wood, also in the lignin of the barley itself, because as we have now all found out, I hope, the husk of a barley is essentially just a tiny wee barrel. Which we'll come to in a little second. And that's going to be given kind of caramel notes, but red fruit notes as well, that kind of leathery, smoky element coming through. And in nature, it's found most prevalently in the anal glands of beavers. So if the Caps, could you bring the beaver through here, and we're going to squeeze its arse for you. Again, something my mother never thought she would hear me say. Highly prized scent for perfumers who get it in a different way these days, but a really, really weird, compelling scent, but which acts as a fantastic, fantastic base note in there. So it's there. It can be an off note in whiskey. It can mean kind of moldy grain, but it is there. That kind of these kind of elements come here. So it kind of moves us off into a different area of distillation and our next whiskey, Ryan.
Actually, there's a couple of for you to. Actually, do you want to pour us a little out as well? There's a bit of a clear liquid. It's on the new make.
Oh, the new make, sorry.
Because there's some as new make for you guys to taste or smell at least as well.
Would you like it in a small cup, or do you want it in a pint mug as usual?
Let's take a wee pint. So there is a little clear liquid, which is probably the safest one of the other samples around. This one you actually can smell and taste. But what you also have is a cask sample. It's 59%, again, a little pokey. But you have a mature Macduff, and then you have the new make as well. And we're looking at this cereal note, this dustiness, this earthiness, but this nuttiness as well. Dave talked a bit before about that, the quick mash, getting that cloudy wort through, that short ferment, that nuttiness in there. So if those of you who've got the new make to smell as well.
If not, we've got some up here if you want to come and taste it afterwards. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Macduff. Kind of weird, really weird stills. Kind of turn the corner, horizontal condensers, which nobody can really explain about. Short fermentation, promoting that nuttiness, but that kind of weird still is going to encourage that reflux. So you're still going to get lighter characters coming through. So it's actually a very, very complex spirit and severely underrated, I think, Macduff. Sometimes it smells of skunk, actually. It's fantastic. None of you smoke marijuana, clearly. Okay, so do you want to have a wee taste of the Macduff? That's glass number 2, by the way.
It's got some nice little bits flowing around with it, which makes you know we've got you the good stuff. This is a really delicious whiskey, actually. I think it's just... Sorry? Truffle.
Yeah. Truffle, mushroomy. Yeah. We're in exactly the right ballpark with that. And we're right back to the basics here. We're back to a prime flavour within whiskey, which is that nutty, spicy cereal note, which we ought to be exploiting more. And there is beginning to be work done in Scotland. There's certainly a lot of work being done in America of breeding barley for flavour, using new varieties or breeding new varieties, which will be flavour driven and won't necessarily be particularly high yielding, but you're actually going to get more interesting and more compelling spirits. There are trials underway in Scotland already on this with the James Hutton Institute and the Scotch Whisky Research Institute. So watch this space for about a decade, but that's why whiskey's a long-term spirit. So there's a lot of work being done, and the industry looking at itself and sort of saying, how can we build in new flavours? Okay, we might not be able to compromise in yield in some distilleries, but in other distilleries we can, because we have to be driving flavour forward. And if I was opening a new distillery in Scotland, which I wouldn't, I'd open it in Wales, because better to be the second in Wales than the 120th in Scotland, I would certainly be looking at barley for flavour. Westland over there in Washington State, leading the world in terms of working with guys like Dan Barber and various folk up there.
And the universities, agricultural universities, trying to understand the terroir. How can you express these flavors in the barley? Barley was a crop that was adapted to different parts of the world, and that adaptation allowed it to have express different characteristics. You know, if you've got a squat, the one that needs to battle against the hardship of a really tough climate, it concentrates its oils, ends up as a really, really oily liquid. Nightmare to process, but that will then convert into new sets of flavors. And what is there to be explored? And this is a whole range of things that we can look at, and it's really kind of uncharted territory in whiskey at the moment. And you know, of course, that's going to then layer on all of these other aspects of flavor that can be created through the various other aspects of production. But it's another cog that can be used to find new ways to push whiskey into the world of flavor that surrounds it.
And it's also involved roasting, which takes us seamlessly onto our next prop. Because in whiskey, we don't roast the barley. We kiln it. We might add peat to add some phenolic characters to it, but we're not like brewers. You know, whiskey distillers are not like brewers, so we're not using different roasts of barley, apart from a couple of exceptions, you know, Glenmorangie being one. But the world of coffee, I think whiskey can learn a huge amount from.
So you have two little sample cups. One of them is really shiny and black and is going to stink. And the other one should be much more, it's a lot lighter, it's not glossy, and it should be quite interesting. So the dark roast, I don't drink coffee, so I stuck my nose into this and was totally repulsed. It doesn't smell like anything pleasant to me. It smells like sulfur, which is what is created. And as Dave pointed out, as I was sniffing this, is like, but that's what most people associate with the smell of having their cup of coffee. So we have this heavily roasted, delicious Italian roast from Starbucks, which they're proudly promoting as a dark roast. And you should notice that straight away. Glossy beans, very, very dark in color. And essentially, you're taking it towards that charcoal spectrum. You stick your nose into it and you're thinking on where things char too much. They go towards that acrid set of flavors. You know, you push it, I mean, you can create smoke in these lovely phenols, but you can also create kind of tar, creosote, nasty, kind of very, very heavy flavors as well. The other is actually something that my girlfriend roasted. She roasted the coffee for 3 consecutive world champions and 1 world taste champion. I don't drink the stuff, but apparently she knows what she's doing with it. And it's from a layman's perspective, you get a lot more of a fruitiness in there. Now, if we're looking at this in coffee, this is a terroir-driven thing. She travels around the world working with farmers, finding coffees that express something that they are creating. She works hand in hand with them. They have an intricate understanding of their land, their space, and their crop. Now, that's a wonderful thing to be able to have that relationship with and then process to kind of create a product for us to enjoy. And it's a whole new world that's not really been explored in terms of whiskey as well. We roast for yield, which is of course important, and we obviously make delicious products out of it as well. It's not like this is a disastrous process in Scotch, like our good old Starbucks coffee. But it does mean that there's opportunities here. If we look at the degrees of roast, I mean, between those two products, you have, you know, it's light and dark. You know, very, very that's two sides of the spectrum. But in between that point, what is happening if you kiln it a little bit more? If you take it towards what happens if you use crystal malts or things that are slightly paler or things that have taken on some of this nuttiness? What does that mean in that whole process of transformation through all of the chains of whiskey production? And I think there's just something really interesting in comparing these two and trying to understand how that might translate to the world of flavors available in Scotch as well.
And it's also there, I'm kind of aware that they were slightly overrunning already, but you know, it's also there within mature spirits, and it's there almost as an underlying character, perhaps. And I think that's something that we've really got to start thinking about here, because you know, whiskey is pointy. I don't know if Lauren's here, but you know, single malt whiskey is pointy. It's all about intensifying that individual distillery character, which is what defines Aberfeldy from Altmore, for example. But when that pointiness in that extreme flavour that you notice most as the dominant character, underneath all of that is built upon like a triangle. So you have all these different elements sitting within it, the complexity of the single malt itself. So it's pointy, but at the same time there's a hell of a lot of underlying stuff. And again, kind of inverting the perfumer's triangle of top note, middle note, base note on its side. There you have a cocktail glass. You know, so having that balance within the whiskey is the same as having a balance within a mixed drink. So again, it is something to look at the hidden flavors, the underlying flavors, which are existing within whiskey itself as well. And that could include even like overcooked casks, which actually play a very important role giving structure to a blend. We're going to jump forward just a little bit to our next planet, which is planet Sulfur. This planet stinks. Breathing apparatus was needed. The landscape was obscured by clouds of gas. The sky, when we could see it, was yellow. There are volcanoes. Samples of the air were taken as high in levels and aromas of gunpowder and cooking vegetables, too noxious to live in because of the high levels of sulfur.
Brimstone.
Okay.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating about this is it surrounds us. Sulfur is not something that is isolated and is only in those really stinky, dangerous things that you crop up if you spend too much time near a volcano. It's very much all around. It's in onions and garlic and shiitake mushrooms and coffee. That's that sulfur compound again. Overcooked cabbages, the brassicas, once they start to stew down. I think the aversion to Brussels sprouts is down to this then huge concentration of sulfur compounds. But it's also there in things like grapefruits and tropical fruits, mangoes, things that are super volatile. They will rise out very, very quickly, and we will notice them in tiny quantities. But they will exist in backgrounds of things as well. They're not only there to kind of be over the top. And do you want to explain George Orwell being up here as well?
George Orwell down there. George Orwell got the inspiration for 1984 dystopian novel by smelling the corridors of the BBC, which smelt of cooking cabbage, and he said it was a smell of totalitarianism and despair. So he's there. Okay. He also looks like my dad, strangely. There we go.
And we have something fun for you to smell with this, actually.
Yeah, we got a couple of things. You might have a few grains in a little pot. That's kalanamak, which is cheese. Cheese, it's not cheese. Salt, black salt from India. It smells really eggy. Yeah, okay, excellent. Everybody's going, oh, that's fucking disgusting. We told you, so yeah, really, really eggy. Would you ever use this in a drink? Damn right you should use that in a drink. Because if you add some of that to a strawberry daiquiri, or you add some of that into blackcurrant, that eggy smell disappears, but the strawberry character and the blackcurrant character is driven up. So it suddenly becomes a flavor enhancer. This ingredient, which is so noxious, and so horrible and eggy, is in fact something which has a great, great asset, potentially to a bartender, and certainly to a cook. And we also have something else for you as well.
So go easy on this next one. So this is, it's asafoetida, which the name might help suggest what it might smell like. And
that's like yellow powder, by the way, guys. Okay.
So it's a resin that's collected from the rhizomes of a ferula family, kind of related to the carrot parsley family. It's highly sulfurous. Has anybody picked it up and had a sniff yet? Yes. Yeah, you make a mistake when you stick your nose into that one too much. But it transforms when cooked. It's not like a background note, like just there to just disappear. It transforms everything else. It complements all of particularly the spices that we used in Indian food. This is the foundation of Indian food. So then alongside your cumins, your mustard seeds, your chilies, your curry leaves, your ginger, your garlic, it then harmonizes and builds. This is what gives the kind of complexity. It's like our mirepoix in kind of French cooking. It gives a greater depth and complexity to it. Onions are also a good source of sulfur, but what it does once cooked and transformed is it helps then lift everything. Yeah, I can start smelling it now. Interestingly, actually, when it was so prized, and there was a Roman ingredient called siliphium, it was related to kind of fennel, and asafoetida was used as the kind of replacement when people, through their love of siliphium, drove it to extinction. And because it's similar to phenol, I think it's got that transformative effect that I think we can relate to in a bartender sense with something like your absinthe. It's not even there to be detected. You can use it as a spot. That spot in a martini is not there to taste absinthe in your martini. It means that, and quoting Gaz Regan on it, it's the alchemy of it. You therefore somehow taste more of the juniper as a result of it being there. And that's the wonderful thing about some of these things. Substrata use of ingredients. It's there to kind of actually give this whole magical effect to everything else around it. And sulfur is that. It's this crazy ingredient that by itself does stink, but what it does to then transform other things it's combined with is really fascinating.
And it's there in whiskey. I mean, it's there in life. You know, as Luca Chirin said, is another book you should read, Secret Scent. It's there about it. It's a building block, you know. One of the 5 elements that make up all life. You know, sulfur is around us all the time. Deal with it, guys. There's a great kind of anti-sulfur camp in Scotch whisky. You know, people say, "Oh, they just really hate it, and there's good sulfur and there's bad sulfur." It's there. High levels of sulfur, yes, they will be off-putting in a whisky, but a small amount might give lift, and a small amount in a new make spirit. He said seamlessly, moving on to our next tasting, which is whisky number 3. Is actually a real advantage if you're making a particular style of whisky. So what we've got here is Craigellachie. Craigellachie is the complete opposite of something like Brackla, for example, in terms of distillation goes. Long ferments, still used there, clear wort. But the condensing system is a worm tub. Worm tub basically just being a further extension of the line arm, a single coil of copper which is immersed in a cold water tank. And you look at it and you think, well, that's a hell of a lot of copper, therefore that's going to lighten the spirit up. It's not. There's not a lot of active copper in a worm tub. Therefore, what will happen is that instead of removing heavy sulfury elements within the whisky, which is what you're happening in Brackla, with that reflux, etc., they are retained. And deliberately so. And you smell it as a new make, and it's a real stinky, sulfury spirit. But so is Glenkinchie, so is Speyburn, so is Balblair. You know, there's a lot of whiskies out there which are sulfury as new makes, but over time, like the Asafoetida, like the Kalanamak, boom, the sulfur is transformed and absorbed or is vented off, and underneath it is actually quite a gentle, fruity character. Craigellachie famously has got a kind of pineapple aroma to it. Now, I just wonder if the pineapple in Craigellachie isn't so much an ester, but actually perhaps that residual sulfur beginning to change in some way. Fascinating, fascinating distillery. And just evidence that sulfur can be your friend in whiskey, just as it can be in mixing drinks as well. So, Ryan, what do we have here?
So what we have is a sulfur punch. It will be a little stinky. This is there on purpose, and it should help then...
Stinky punch.
Stinky punch. And it's using a couple of things. So it's looking at the idea of substrata, and it's also looking at the idea of transformation. So we've done a fermentation using a white grape with various different herbs that's then been oxygenated, so micro-oxygenated. It's then been slightly soured into a vinegar. So we create a shrub, not through preserving fruits in a vinegar base and then and kind of making a cordial that way, but preserving them in a fermentation and then souring that fermentation. And then we've also used some oak moss. Again, that kind of weird stinky thing in the background. And used in a lot of perfumery. I've made this a little heavy-handed because I want it to be there. But it will start to, as you get used to it, as you sip away, as it changes, as you drink through the drink and it dilutes, you're going to start to pick up the other fruity notes within Craigellachie. So it's just a green tea, really simple on top of it as well. But then you're getting this lovely fruitiness that should start to rise out from within the cocktail.
Oak moss is amazing stuff. You know, it's a chypre in perfumery. Johnny Walker Green Label's got a lot of it actually in it. So I know I'm not meant to mention other brands, but it does. What do you think of the drink? If you've got it, you haven't got it yet. It's great, I can tell you. It's really, really, it's fascinating. Yeah, and it's got that kind of little kind of sulfury lift, but in again, kind of coming back to a word we've been using a lot, compelling characteristic. Because what we've done here, guys, is we kind of shifted, hopefully over the past 5 years, away from that paradigm of thou shalt not mix with Scotch into this new area of Scotch being a drink which is permissible to mix with. Dreadful word to use. Of course you can use it. It's a drink. But I do wonder if all we've done is just kind of bump along a couple of squares, really, and to the point that Scotch cocktail is just something that has had vanilla added or smoke added or is made with smoky whiskey, rather than actually really examining the most complex oak-aged spirit in the world and saying, how can we relate to all these kind of weird and extreme flavors which exist in balance within Scotch and accentuate them in new and exciting and vibrant and forward-thinking drinks?
Because, of course, Scotch, there are examples that are light and delicate, and they can be used in a manner that's light and delicate. They can be aperitifs, they can be summer serves. But there's also big flavors, and we should be able to match big flavors with big flavors. I think there's a wonderful analogy, going back to that kind of perfumers thing. There's the Estee Lauder perfume of white cotton was all about these lovely, delicate notes, and it was very, very pure, and they had to put a big load of funk underneath it. There's real sexual undertone to all of it that made white cotton become more white cotton. And I think the same thing exists with whiskey cocktails, is using things that push it out a bit, help work with the characteristics of the heart of it. We can use sulfur, or we can use stinky flavors to help demonstrate the kind of range of complexity that can also be within it. You have got quite a stinky sulfur punch.
I mean, even vanilla, you know, our old bland friend vanilla, is actually a really fascinating aroma. Like links an interesting way to almond. So there's a nice kind of accord between vanilla and almond. You can even push it into a floral aspect. You can push it as far as mineral. It kind of underpins that. Or vanilla can be driven into deeper areas and kind of make accords with our old friend, the beaver's arse as well. so vanilla, I'm not dismissing vanilla completely. What I'm saying is don't just think, oh, boom, let's just drop a little bit of vanilla in here. But actually then begin to analyze what vanilla is and say, well, how can I then use that in a creative fashion? Does that make sense?
It does indeed.
Yeah. We're going to move on to our final planet. Is that our final? Yes, it is. You'll be pleased to hear. Or maybe not. Maybe you want to stay here all night. Planet Air.
Suitably psychedelic.
Yeah. The air seems clear and sharp. It made us feel lightheaded, energized, and reckless. The aromas were those which seemed to touch on other planets, and there's fruits similar to esters. The initial effect was indeed psychedelic. In time, some of the party began to find the smell of overripeness and nuttiness, and cracks began to show. Things began to seem to fall apart. Air. Is it our friend or is it our enemy in the world of whiskey or in the world in general?
So air is something that can be both friend and foe. So it breaks down elements, transforms them, but let it run too far and it also destroys stuff. So this happens in probably the most evident way in things like rusting. So you have something that is seemingly the strongest compound we can create. We have an iron girder supporting our bridges and buildings, but it will rust in contact with water and oxygen. And actually, this is what happens to us in our tissues. What keeps us alive, our respiration, our transformation of things through those processes is also what destroys us. That oxidation, we literally rust as we stay alive. That's what happens as we grow older. And that's why you'll see a lot of things that are antioxidants. They are there to retard this process of us rusting. It's why you're told to eat a rainbow and have things that are packed full of these ingredients. And they will slow the rate down, and they'll slow the rate down of oxidation in our foods as well. But things will eventually discolor, they'll break down, and that's why we preserve things. We try and retard this process. We try and cheat time. And actually, this is something that we keep coming back to. Again, that idea of trying to control time, being able to cheat it and manifest it in different ways, or exploit it. And I think a lot of the main variables we look at in terms of bartenders, in terms of processing our ingredients, the easy ones are things like time and temperature, and obviously the associated techniques that we can exploit with that. But oxidation is the real enemy of a lot of the things that we're trying to control. It will destroy things quite quickly, but it also can be a positive.
Because controlled oxidation is what maturation is all about. Think about it. You know, you need air to develop yeast. You know, you have to have oxygen in there for fermentation to take place. You need air to develop and mature spirits or wines, which are going to be sitting there in cask. I mean, think about sherry. Sherry is controlled oxidation. And in whiskey, you know, it's the way that the air and the wood and the spirit all begin to dance together that is going to build up complexity over time and activity. So that's why age doesn't matter. Maturity matters, not an age statement. Sorry, Georgie. And also, when you think in terms of breathing, you know, you say, oh, the cask breathes and alcohol leaves the cask. Fine. Yeah, well, actually, something else happens. You know, the air is coming in to the cask. It's not, strictly speaking, oxidation. We had a debate with a couple of masters, Brian Kinsman, actually. And he went, it's not really oxidation, Dave. You're not a chemist. It's actually air itself. And actually changing. But there's a chemical reaction to this, which also helps drive esterification, the creation of new fruits. And if you're in quite a tired cask, not an exhausted cask, but quite a tired cask, the air suddenly becomes more important, and a more important driver of flavour within whiskey. So rather than having a big hit of wood with a little bit of air coming in, underneath that, you've got much more of the air and the flavours and the aromas which are driven by that kind of, let's just call it controlled oxidation, which takes us back to our old friend, rancio, once more. So it exists within whiskey, controlled oxidation. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have mature spirit. So it's an important one to take on board. And it's a natural process.
So we apply some of these techniques in our drinks quite a bit. So using things like a rotavap, where it pulls all the air out of the system, or doing things sous vide. So removing the air out, forcing things together, and allowing those other processes such as temperature and time to have their effect, but taking the oxygen out of the equation. And there's times where we then want to promote it. So using things like the micro-oxygenation I talked before, using a fish tank to pump a load of air through something, or something that Mikey, our head bartender at Dandelion, really championed and pioneered, which is essentially a rusting. This is almost like a nod to the galvanization. So it has got an element of rust as a characteristic, and this is safe, don't worry. Ferrous oxide can be toxic as well. But this is done and rusted in a manner that is safe. But it's also sacrificial. So it's using this as a catalyst to then change the way the other flavors develop. So again, nodding back to our time travel series, all the ways that we've been trying to look at how time is an aspect of it, and air is so linked to that change. So the rancio aspect that Dave talked about, those long periods where air is having the ability to help it age in and of itself, create these tertiary flavors that we find so alluring. Being able to try and cheat that in another manner, force it together, catalyze it, help it rust, help it oxidize and age in a manner that's done a lot quicker than we have to wait 30 or 40 years for. So we have a rusted Manhattan. As got pointed out before, why didn't we do a rusty nail? Because we're not that smart. And
it's too obvious.
Yes,
yeah.
too obvious.
Way too obvious. A rusty staple would have been good.
But this is not, this is nuanced. It's allowing those elements together. Yes, it's, and yes, it should be a Rob Roy as well. But it's looking at those characteristics. Vermouth is not the enemy of whiskey. We just become lazy mixing Scotch and go, right, well, we'll just pair it with the same way that it always ends up paired with in other whiskey cocktails that we've seen. This is actually, we really pimped your drink here and used Altmore 18 in this. But it's balancing this towards the Altmore. So what you should find is, yes, that sweetness, all of those characteristics of the vermouth, that light bittersweet play, bringing out the notes within the whiskey, but the whiskey singing through with this. And the rust is there to give a depth, a different background to it, but help to transform those flavors that are within the whiskey and showcase them in a different manner.
And Altmore is an absolutely fantastic whiskey, very underrated whiskey, and not really seen until very recently as a single malt, because it was so valued by blenders, because it has a delicacy and fruitiness and a floral character, but also this wonderful texture, a kind of soft, very unctuous texture on the mid-palate. Which makes it a very, very useful whiskey for a blending point of view, for it adds that kind of middle palate, richness and softness and unctuousness. So thanks, Georgie, for breaking out the 18-year-old. And talking about that, I should be in local radio, really. Talking about that, The one element which our science officer kind of pointed out was missing was this thing called umami. And within this flavor solar system that we've been exploring, umami operates as the dark matter. It is the thing which holds everything together. Umami is so, so important. Texture is so, so important.
And I think that textural aspect is something that we particularly love doing in our drinks. It's something it's overlooked. It's something that we do intuitively. The techniques we apply to classic cocktails, the manner in which they're built, shaken, stirred, whatever we apply to them, helps introduce that texture that's so crucial to the flavor delivery of it. But it's also something that can be manipulated not only through textural agents, but also through the flavor. So you have it. So this, you've got a little umami bomb on there with your fish sauce. It's ramped up in there, but it's in stocks, those dashes that you create to give depth of food, marmites, parmesans, cured meat, asparagus, tomatoes, mushrooms. All of these things are really high in these glutamates that help give a different texture to what you add them to. And breast milk.
Jake Burker told me that one.
Yeah. Actually, one that I've not added to a cocktail, although I've used formula milk, similar. But these are things that then can be used to kind of build in textures as well as flavors into your cocktails. Sorry, I'm just kind of.
Oh yes, I have.
Yeah, I've completely lost myself now.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Umami, I'm sure you all know about umami. It's kind of weird because when I started teaching about whiskey and learning about umami, it was kind of, right, tell me all the tastes, guys. And nobody had heard of it. And people began laughing and everybody knows about it.
And actually,
and it's fascinating. And it's, if you don't know what it is, it's the it's the in food. It's what makes you go, I like it. And from a whiskey maker's point of view, I spend a fair amount of time in Japan, and it's interesting talking to Japanese blenders who talk about grain whiskey as being the umami in the blend, because grain adds that kind of middle palate softness and unctuousness. So yeah, and that's kind of Japanese way of looking at it, because coming back to that point earlier, we're kind of moving in a cultural fashion as well.
And it's not a blank canvas then, using the grain whiskey to create this better flavor. But it's, from a bartending perspective, the other one that's quite interesting is the kind of kokumi, the related one. And we did a Negroni using a beef tea, a beef stock. And it just gives this amazing richness, but it also actually gives a minerality. And it's really fascinating what those kind of big flavors can do to add textures and change the flavors around them. So it might seem like an odd thing to include Marmite or fish sauce or breast milk if you're so inspired. But what it will do is what it can do to create and change the flavors that it surrounds by as well.
If you are using breast milk, please get the owner's permission first. Okay. Moving swiftly on.
Yay!
Yeah. And there we are. We're kind of back at leaving our solar system, and look what the sun is in our solar system. It's Pikachu on acid. It's complex. It's complexity, because like anyone's
interested, Columbia, South Carolina will have the apocalypse. So
good.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, sounds like it should do. Yeah. Right. Thank you for that. Okay. But a solar system holds, everything is in balance. All the planets are actually interfering with, balancing each other out with their gravitational fields. So it's not just one flavor sitting there on its own and another flavor sitting there on its own. It's a totality which is occurring within a solar system, a totality which is happening within whiskey, a totality which should be happening in your mixed drinks. And that's something to think about. That's something to engage with as well. They don't exist on their own. They're all interrelated. They're all interdependent. I'm not wanting to get too zen about it, but they are. And that leads us into blending of Scotch whiskies. All these different component parts, pointiness coming together to produce something which is greater than the sum of those parts as well. But we've deluded ourselves in thinking that Scotch can just be one or two things. We're too lazy. We're too lazy as writers. We're too lazy, I would argue, as bartenders. I would even hazard a guess that the distillers need to push this thing even further.
We played it very safe with whiskey. And it's one of those things where we've held it on this pedestal, and just because it's got this mass concentration of flavor and all of the things that we do love whiskey for, it's what brought us all here to be able to kind of talk through these things, and it's the reason why we love to be able to try and ask our friends to pull out ridiculous whiskeys from their casks. That doesn't mean, though, that it can't be celebrated in this other manner. We've become lazy of the way of just thinking that just because it's complex and precious, that it needs to be treated with kid gloves. And it's a shame. It's holding Scotch back, and it's holding it back from reaching a wider audience of people as well.
Quick quote there from the composer John Cage. I'm not interested in my world being a communication from me to the listener. I want it to be from the sounds to the listener. So I make a music in which I'm not so much the composer, but the listener too. Now apply that to bartending, or apply it to writing, or whatever. Think about who the end user is. Engage with the world. That is what is so important about it. Turn things on their heads, guys. We've all been trained to look at things from the point of view of the spirit. This is what Scotch does. This is what cognac does. There are no commonalities. There are rules. Bollocks. There are no rules anymore. There are just flavors, and flavors which exist all around the world. Right.
And this is where we need to start looking from. So if we can start to find these flavors in the world, we can find them in our Scotch. We can find the way that people apply these wonderful things. This should be challenging. What's the fun in making it easy? You know, going back to that point at the beginning, we're not creatures that want to have that gratuitous balance. You know, it's very, very easy for us to just kind of sit around, get really fat, and get diabetes eating a load of sugar and salt. It's really, obviously it's not that drastic with what we're doing with our drinks, but you know, what we want to be able to do is kind of push it, be able to challenge ourselves, be able to look for things that are much more compelling in that world of flavor, find things that make us uncomfortable, make us feel like we're exploring new territories in terms of those flavors, and challenge ourselves so we can challenge those who surround us as well.
And that's kind of what we've been doing for the past 5 years. This is not the end, well, this is the end of the class pretty much, but it's not the end of Scotch. We're not sort of saying, right, okay, now we've solved everything. This is kind of what is going to happen next, guys. I would just like to say thank you so much to Georgie for everything. She's been astounding. I would very much, I'd like to get all the caps out here, if we can get all the caps out here, because they have been absolutely awesome. Yeah. You know, as ever, we've made their lives hell by putting on a class which is way too complicated. Thank you for buying the tickets. Please start thinking about Scotch in a new way, and think about all drinks in a new way. Live long and prosper, my dear friends. Ryan, I would just like to say thank you. It's been an honour to have sat beside you for the past 5 years, mate.
5 years of chaos. It's been
still
brilliant.
in awe of your talent. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Adios.